Maria Silva looked at the diamond ring on her finger and smiled nervously. After dating Robert Henderson for 3 years, they were finally engaged. She should have been completely happy, but something worried her. Today, both families would meet for the first time. "It's going to be fine," Robert said, squeezing her hand as they walked up to his parents' large house in the expensive part of town. "They'll love you, so they'll love your dad too." Maria wasn't so sure. She had met Robert's parents, George and Diane Henderson, several times before. They owned Henderson Real Estate, one of the biggest agencies in the city. They always dressed perfectly, drove expensive cars, and talked about their country club memberships. They were polite to Maria, but she often caught them exchanging looks when she mentioned her background. Unlike the Hendersons, Maria came from a simple family. Her mother had died when she was 12, and her father Eduardo had raised her alone. Eduardo Silva was a 72-year-old immigrant who had worked as a janitor at the local university for over 30 years. He still worked night shifts despite his age, saying it kept him active. "Dad, please remember to wear the new shirt I bought you," Maria said on the phone that morning. "And the good shoes, not your work ones." "Don't worry so much, Maija," Eduardo replied with his thick accent. "I know how to dress for important things." When Eduardo's old Toyota pulled into the Hendersons' circular driveway that evening, Maria held her breath. Her father stepped out wearing a clean blue button-up shirt and his best pants, freshly pressed. His hands were rough and slightly stained from years of using cleaning chemicals, but his smile was warm and proud. "Welcome, Mr. Silva," Diane Henderson said at the door, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "We've heard so much about you." "Please call me Eduardo," Maria's father said, handing Diane a small potted plant. "I grow these orchids myself." George Henderson looked at the simple gift with a small frown before putting on a smile. "Well, isn't that thoughtful?" Inside, the dinner table was set with fine china and crystal glasses. Eduardo looked slightly uncomfortable but sat with good posture, trying his best to fit in. As they ate, the Hendersons asked polite questions about his work. 30 years at the university? That's dedication," George said, sipping his expensive wine. "Though I imagine they must have good benefits to keep you there so long." "The work is honest," Eduardo replied, "and it gave my Maria the employee discount for her nursing degree." When Eduardo mentioned he still took the night shift despite his age, Diane leaned toward her husband and whispered, "How quaint." Her voice was just loud enough for Maria to hear. Throughout dinner, Maria noticed more whispers and looks between the Hendersons whenever her father spoke with his accent or mentioned something about his simple life. Robert seemed oblivious, laughing and keeping the conversation going. Later, as they discussed wedding plans, George Henderson announced, "We've already looked into the Westfield Country Club for the reception. As members, we can get a significant discount." "That's very generous," Eduardo said. "But I've saved some money too. I want to contribute to my daughter's special day." Diane's eyebrows rose. "Oh, well, perhaps you could handle something small. Maybe the flowers?" Maria saw her father's smile fade slightly, but he nodded politely. As they drove home that night, Maria felt a weight in her chest. They think he's beneath them, she thought, watching her father's tired profile as he drove. And Robert didn't even notice. Little did any of them know what Eduardo Silva had been quietly planning for decades, or how it would change everything on the wedding day. The weeks following the first dinner were filled with wedding planning. Maria and Robert set their wedding date for 6 months later, in May, when the weather would be perfect for the outdoor ceremony they both wanted. Diane Henderson took charge immediately. She created a group chat for planning and added everyone except Eduardo, claiming he probably doesn't use smartphones anyway. When Maria quietly added her father to the group, he rarely commented, but she knew he read everything. One Saturday morning, the families met at the Westfield Country Club to tour the venue. Eduardo arrived 15 minutes early, wearing his best sweater and carrying a small notebook to write down information. The Hendersons pulled up in their Mercedes 30 minutes late. "Sorry we're late," Diane said, not looking sorry at all. "Our golf game ran long. Shall we begin?" The venue coordinator, Ms. Barnes, led them through the grand ballroom with its crystal chandeliers and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking perfectly manicured gardens. "This package starts at $45,000, Ms. Barnes explained. which includes the ceremony space, reception for 150 guests, basic flowers, and a standard menu. Eduardo's eyes widened at the price, but he said nothing. When Ms. Barnes stepped away to take a call, he quietly approached Maria. "Mija," he whispered, "this is very beautiful, but very expensive. I have saved $20,000 for your wedding. I don't think." George Henderson overheard and cut in. "Don't worry about it, Eduardo. We'll cover what you can't. It's important that our son has a wedding that reflects our family's standing." Eduardo's face flushed. "I can provide for my daughter." "Of course you can," Diane said with a thin smile, "within your means. But this wedding requires a different level of means." Maria felt torn between defending her father and keeping peace. Robert, once again, seemed not to notice the tension. Later that week, Eduardo invited everyone to his small house for dinner to discuss more wedding plans. He had spent all day cooking traditional dishes from his homeland. His house was modest but spotlessly clean, with photos of Maria covering the walls. The Hendersons arrived late again, bringing expensive wine that Eduardo didn't know how to serve properly. When they sat in his small living room, Diane kept her purse on her lap instead of setting it down. "I have an idea to share," Eduardo said after dinner, his voice hopeful. "My friend Carlos owns the community center. It's recently renovated, very nice, and he would rent it to us for a small fee. The church next door has beautiful gardens for the ceremony. Together, they would cost only $5,000. George nearly choked on his wine. "A community center? For our son's wedding? You can't be serious." "It's a beautiful place," Eduardo insisted, showing photos on his old tablet. "Many important community events happen there." "I'm sure it's fine for neighborhood quinceañeras," Diane said with a laugh, "but this is a proper wedding." Maria saw the hurt in her father's eyes. "Dad's suggestion is practical," she tried to defend him. "We could use the money we saved for our future home." Robert put his arm around Maria. "Honey, we want to give you the wedding of your dreams. Let my parents help." Eduardo fell silent, but Maria noticed his hands, rough from decades of hard work, clenched tightly on his lap. When the Hendersons left, Maria found her father sitting alone on the porch swing. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "No te preocupes, Mija," Eduardo replied softly. "Some people measure worth by what you own, not who you are." What no one realized was that Eduardo had made a decision that night, one that would change everything on the wedding day. Before the wedding, tensions between the families reached a new high. The Hendersons had taken over almost every aspect of the planning, often making decisions without consulting Maria or Eduardo. One Tuesday evening, Maria visited her father after her hospital shift. She found Eduardo at his small kitchen table, carefully reviewing a stack of papers. When she entered, he quickly slipped them into a folder. "Dad, what are you working on?" Maria asked, kissing his cheek. "Nothing important, just some personal business," Eduardo said with a small smile. "How was my beautiful daughter today?" Maria sighed and sat down. The wedding planner called. "Mrs. Henderson changed our flower choices again without telling me. She said my choices were too simple and ethnic." Eduardo's eyes showed a flash of anger, but his voice remained calm. "This is your wedding, Mija? You should have what makes you happy." "I know, but Robert thinks I should just let his mother handle it to keep the peace. He says it's not worth fighting over flowers." Eduardo reached for his daughter's hand. His fingers were rough against her smooth skin. "And what do you think?" "I think it's not really about the flowers," Maria admitted. "It's about respect." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Robert, looking stressed. "There you are," he said to Maria. "My mother's been trying to reach you. The cake designer needs a final decision tonight." "I turned my phone off to visit with Dad," Maria explained. "I thought we agreed on the cake last week." Robert looked uncomfortable. "Mom thinks the design you chose is too plain. She found something more elegant." Eduardo stood up. "Robert, would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot." "No thanks, Mr. Silva. We really need to get going. The baker closes in an hour." Eduardo nodded. "Of course. But before you go, may I ask you something?" His accent seemed stronger when he was serious. "Do you stand with my daughter? When choices are made about your shared future?" Robert shifted his weight nervously. Sir, I love Maria, but sometimes it's easier to just go with what my parents want. They're paying for most of the wedding after all. I see, Eduardo said quietly. The following weekend, the families gathered at the Hendersons' house for a pre-wedding dinner. The dining room was perfectly decorated, as always. During dinner, George Henderson raised his glass, a toast to our growing family. Though we come from different backgrounds, we're united by our children's love. Eduardo noticed the pause but smiled politely. The conversation turned to wedding gifts. We've purchased them the honeymoon package to Bora Bora, Diane announced proudly. First class all the way. How generous, Eduardo said. I too have been preparing the gift. Oh, Diane's eyebrow raised. Something handmade, I assume? Maria tensed, but Eduardo just smiled. You could say I've been working on it for many years. George laughed a little too loudly. Well, I'm sure whatever you can manage will be appreciated. Later, as dessert was served, Eduardo accidentally knocked over his water glass. As he quickly mopped it up with his napkin, Diane whispered to her husband, cleaning up messes. At least he's good at something. She hadn't whispered quietly enough. The table fell silent. Maria's face flushed with anger. Mrs. Henderson, Eduardo said calmly, looking directly at her, in my country, we believe true character shows in how you treat those you think cannot help you. I clean floors for a living, yes, but my hands built a life of dignity for my daughter. For once, the Hendersons had nothing to say. That night, after dropping Maria off, Eduardo made a phone call to his bank. The conversation was brief but important. With a satisfied smile, he then opened the folder he'd hidden earlier and continued his secret preparations. With just 6 weeks until the wedding day, Maria felt more stressed than excited. What should have been the happiest time of her life had become a constant battle between pleasing Robert's family and honoring her own. The final dress fitting was scheduled at Elegance Bridal, the most expensive boutique in the city. Maria had wanted Eduardo to be there for this special moment, so she had asked him to meet her at the shop after his morning shift at the university. When Maria arrived with Robert's mother and sister, Diane immediately took control. I've asked the consultant to pull a few more options, Diane said. The dress you chose is nice, but I found something more sophisticated. Maria took a deep breath. Mrs. Henderson, I appreciate your help, but I'm very happy with the dress we already picked. The consultant brought out Maria's chosen dress, a beautiful, simple gown with delicate lace sleeves that reminded her of her mother's wedding photo. As Maria tried it on, Eduardo arrived at the boutique. His work uniform was hidden under his good jacket, but his worn shoes gave him away. The receptionist gave him a suspicious look. I'm here for my daughter's fitting, Eduardo explained. Maria Silva. The receptionist pointed to the waiting area. You can wait there. When Maria emerged from the dressing room in her gown, she looked for her father's reaction first. Eduardo's eyes filled with tears. Nay, Princessa, he whispered. You look just like your mother. Diane Henderson frowned. It's pretty dear, but don't you think it's a bit basic? Try the other one I selected. The consultant brought out a heavily beaded gown with a massive train, exactly the opposite of what Maria wanted. This is more fitting for a Henderson wedding, Diane insisted. Eduardo stood up quietly. My daughter looks beautiful in her choice. It suits her perfectly. Diane turned to Eduardo with a cold smile. No offense, Mr. Silva, but you don't exactly move in circles where fine fashion is appreciated. This wedding will be attended by important people in our community. The room fell silent. The consultant looked uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson, Eduardo said calmly, I may not know designer names, but I know my daughter. And she shines brightest when she is true to herself, not when she tries to be someone else. Dad's right, Maria said firmly. I'm wearing the dress I chose. Diane's face hardened. Robert mentioned you can be stubborn. I suppose we know where you get that from. Later that evening, Eduardo received a call from Robert. The young man sounded uncomfortable. Mr. Silva, my parents wanted me to talk to you about the wedding speeches, Robert began. They think it might be best if you keep yours very short, maybe just a few sentences. Eduardo's hand tightened around the phone. May I ask why? Well, they're concerned about. Your accent might make it hard for guests to understand. And they planned a tight schedule for the reception. Eduardo was silent for a long moment. I see. And what do you think, Robert? I think. I think it would avoid any awkwardness. After hanging up, Eduardo sat at his kitchen table, looking at an old photo of himself and Maria's mother. Next to it was a newer photo of Maria and Robert, smiling happily. Elena, he said to his late wife's picture, our daughter deserves better than this. That night, Eduardo made another important phone call, this time to his lawyer. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. When he finally hung up, Eduardo looked at his calendar where the wedding date was circled in red. He made a small note beside it, time to show them who Eduardo Silva really is. The next morning, Eduardo requested his first day off in 3 years. He had important preparations to complete before the wedding day arrived. The weekend before the wedding, Maria noticed something odd about her father. Eduardo had taken several days off work, something he almost never did. When she stopped by his house to drop off his wedding suit, she found him hunched over the dining table with a well-dressed man she didn't recognize. Dad, is everything okay? Maria asked, concerned. Eduardo quickly gathered the papers they had been reviewing. Misha, I didn't expect you today. He stood up and introduced the stranger. This is Mr. Patel, an old friend. We have some business to discuss. Mr. Patel shook Maria's hand. Your father is a remarkable man, Miss Silva. You must be very proud. After Mr. Patel left, Maria helped Eduardo prepare dinner. What kind of business are you doing with Mr. Patel? She asked casually. I didn't know you had friends who wore such expensive suits. Eduardo smiled mysteriously. There are many things about your old father you don't know, Mija, but you will soon. Dad, you're not in any trouble, are you? Maria worried. Eduardo laughed. No trouble. Just finishing something I started many years ago. He changed the subject. How are the wedding preparations? Maria sighed. The rehearsal dinner is tomorrow night. Mrs. Henderson has planned everything down to the minute. What Maria didn't know was that Eduardo Silva had been living a double life for decades. His secret began 30 years ago, when he first started working as a janitor at the university. While cleaning the economics department late at night, Eduardo had befriended Professor James Williams, who often worked late. The professor was impressed by Eduardo's curiosity about the financial papers and books he was reading. You have a natural mind for numbers, Eduardo, Professor Williams had told him one night. You should learn about investing. Under the professor's guidance, Eduardo began investing $50 each month from his modest salary. He read everything he could about the stock market and financial planning. As years passed, his small investments grew steadily. But that wasn't Eduardo's only secret. While cleaning the engineering department, he had noticed problems with the industrial cleaning equipment. Drawing on his practical experience, Eduardo designed a simple but effective improvement to the floor scrubber. With help from another kind professor, he patented his design and licensed it to a cleaning equipment manufacturer. The royalties were modest at first, but over 20 years, they had grown substantial. Eduardo lived simply, saving almost everything. His plan had always been the same, to ensure Maria would never struggle financially as he had. On Monday morning, 3 days before the wedding, Eduardo visited his bank. The manager, Mrs. Chen, greeted him warmly. Everything is arranged as you requested, Mr. Silva, she said, leading him to her office. The trust fund documents are ready, and the property transfer papers just need your signature. Eduardo reviewed everything carefully before signing. And the timing? The courier will deliver the envelope to you on Saturday morning, as requested, Mrs. Chen confirmed. Eduardo nodded, satisfied. Perfect. The wedding begins at 4 p.m. Later that day, Eduardo visited a high-end neighborhood across town. He stood in front of a beautiful 2-story house with a set old E sign in the yard. He took a photo of it on his old phone. That evening, at the wedding rehearsal dinner, the Hendersons were in full form. The event was held at an exclusive restaurant where George Henderson made sure everyone knew he was a regular. When Eduardo arrived, Diane looked him up and down. At least you're on time, she said, instead of hello. Throughout the evening, the Hendersons made subtle comments about Maria's humble beginnings and how Robert was bringing her into a whole new world. Eduardo remained quiet, only smiling occasionally to himself. When George asked if he was ready for his little speech at the reception, Eduardo nodded. Yes, "I believe I am ready," he said. "I have been preparing for this day for a very long time." The morning of the wedding arrived with perfect blue skies. At his small house, Eduardo woke early. Today was the day everything would change. He made coffee and sat at his kitchen table, looking at the wedding photo of himself and Alina, Maria's mother. "Today is for you too, mi amor," he whispered to the picture. At exactly 10 o'clock a.m., there was a knock at his door. A courier handed him a large envelope. "Special delivery for Mr. Silva. Signature required, please." Eduardo thanked the man and carefully placed the envelope in his briefcase. He then put on his best suit, the only luxury he had bought for himself in years. It wasn't designer-made like the Hendersons' clothes, but it was well-tailored and dignified. Across town, at the Hendersons' mansion, preparations were in full swing. Hairstylists, makeup artists, and photographers filled the house. Maria sat quietly as everyone fussed around her. "Just think," Diane said as she supervised the makeup artist working on Maria, "by tonight, you'll be a Henderson. Your whole life is about to upgrade." Maria forced a smile but said nothing. At the church, Eduardo arrived early to have a quiet moment before the ceremony. The Hendersons had invited over 200 guests, mostly their friends and business associates. Maria had been allowed to invite only 30 people. Robert found Eduardo sitting alone in a side room. "Mr. Silva," Robert said, looking. The reception hall fell completely silent as Maria opened the thick envelope. Her hands trembled as she pulled out several official-looking documents. Robert stood beside her, confused but curious. "What is it?" he whispered as Maria's eyes widened in shock. Maria looked up at her father, her lips parting in disbelief. "Dad, is this real?" Eduardo nodded, his eyes shining with pride. "Yes, Maja, every bit of it." Maria turned to the crowd, her voice shaking with emotion. "My father has just given us a house, completely paid for." Gasps filled the ballroom. Diane Henderson's champagne glass froze halfway to her lips. "Not just any house," Eduardo added, taking a photo from the envelope and holding it up. "This house." The photo showed a beautiful two-story home in Oak Ridge Estates, one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city. It was just 3 streets away from where the Hendersons lived. "And that's not all," Eduardo continued, his voice growing stronger. "Maria, the second document is the trust fund I've been building for you since the day you were born." Maria scanned the paper, her hands now shaking so badly that Robert had to help her hold it. $2.5 million, she whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The crowd erupted in surprised murmurs. George Henderson stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "There must be some mistake," he said, approaching Eduardo. "Where would you get that kind of money?" Eduardo smiled patiently. "No mistake, Mr. Henderson. For 30 years, I worked as a janitor at night. But during the day, I was a student of the market." He turned back to address the stunned guests. "When I came to this country, I had nothing but hope and willingness to work hard. While cleaning the economics department at the university, I became friends with Professor Williams. He taught me about investing. I started with just $50 a month from my salary." Eduardo's voice carried through the silent room. No one was checking watches now. "I lived simply, I saved, I invested wisely, and 25 years ago, I patented a special attachment for industrial floor cleaners that is now used in hospitals across the country. The royalties have been quite good." Maria stared at her father in amazement. "You never told me." "I wanted to surprise you, Maja, and perhaps—" Eduardo glanced briefly at the Hendersons. "To teach a lesson about judging people by appearances." Robert looked through the documents in awe. "Mr. Silva, this is incredible. I don't know what to say." Eduardo placed his hand on Robert's shoulder. "Say you will take good care of my daughter. Say you will remember that wealth is not about showing off, but about creating security and helping others." At the Hendersons' table, Diane was frantically whispering to her husband. Their faces had turned from shock to calculating. George quickly approached Eduardo with an outstretched hand. "Eduardo, my friend, what an amazing surprise. We had no idea you were so successful." His voice dripped with sudden respect. Eduardo shook his hand firmly but said nothing. Maria hugged her father tightly, tears streaming down her face. Why did you keep working as a janitor all these years if you didn't need to? Eduardo smiled. Because honest work is nothing to be ashamed of, and because I love watching young people learn and grow at the university. A photographer captured the moment, Maria and Robert embracing Eduardo, while the documents lay open on a nearby table. In the background, the Hendersons stood awkwardly, their expressions a mixture of shock and newfound appreciation. As the band began playing again, Eduardo found himself surrounded by guests suddenly eager to speak with him. Many of them had previously barely acknowledged his presence. Across the room, Maria watched her father with new eyes. The man everyone had underestimated had just become the most interesting person at the wedding. 1 month after the wedding, Maria and Robert sat on the back patio of their new home. The summer evening was perfect, warm with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of the garden Eduardo had helped them plant. I still can't believe this is our house, Maria said, looking around at the spacious yard and beautiful kitchen visible through the glass doors. Robert squeezed her hand. Your father changed everything, and not just with the house and money. The weeks following the wedding had been a whirlwind of change. The morning after the reception, the Hendersons had shown up at Eduardo's small house with pastries and coffee, suddenly eager to get to know their new family member better. Eduardo had received them politely but without excitement. When Diane commented on how charming his small house was, Eduardo simply smiled. It served its purpose, he had said. Just like my janitor's uniform. Now, as Maria and Robert enjoyed their evening, the doorbell rang. Robert went to answer it and returned with Eduardo and, surprisingly, Robert's parents. Look who I found in the driveway, Eduardo said with a small smile. The Hendersons stood awkwardly behind him, holding a gift basket. We were just in the neighborhood, George Henderson explained, though everyone knew their visit was deliberate. Maria welcomed them to the patio, noting how differently the Hendersons behaved toward her father now. Diane even sat next to Eduardo, asking him detailed questions about his investment strategies. You must have a financial advisor you trust, she said eagerly. We'd love a recommendation. Eduardo shook his head. I make my own decisions. Always have. As the evening progressed, Robert pulled Maria aside. My parents called yesterday, he whispered. Dad's business is struggling. I think they're hoping your father might invest. Maria frowned. Is that why they're suddenly so interested in him? Probably, Robert admitted. But I told them not to ask. It would be wrong after how they treated him. Later, when the Hendersons had gone, Eduardo helped Maria clear the dishes. They will ask for money soon, Eduardo said matter-of-factly. People like that always do. Will you help them? Maria asked. Eduardo carefully dried a glass before answering. That depends on Robert. On me? Robert looked up, surprised. Yes, Eduardo nodded. On whether you have truly learned to stand up for what is right, even against your own parents. The following week, Eduardo officially retired from his janitor position. The university held a small ceremony honoring his 3 decades of service. To everyone's surprise, half the economics department faculty attended, including the now elderly Professor Williams, who spoke warmly of his most dedicated student. Eduardo used part of his wealth to establish a scholarship fund for the children of maintenance and service workers at the university. He named it after Maria's mother. 3 months after the wedding, the Hendersons' situation worsened. Their real estate business faced bankruptcy after some poor investments. As Eduardo had predicted, they came asking for help. Robert met with them first, alone. When he returned to tell Maria and Eduardo about the conversation, he looked different. More confident, more his own man. I told them we would help on 2 conditions, Robert explained. First, they must treat everyone with respect, regardless of job or background. Second, they must volunteer weekly at the community center where Dad wanted to hold our wedding reception. Eduardo smiled proudly at his son-in-law. And what did they say? They agreed, Robert said. I think they finally understand. That evening, as they sat together looking at old family photos, Maria found a picture of her father in his janitor's uniform, smiling proudly on her college graduation day. You know what's funny, Dad? She said softly. All those years, the Hendersons thought they were better than you because of their money and status. But you were the truly wealthy one all along, not just in money they never knew about, but in dignity, in wisdom, in character. Eduardo patted her hand. The best revenge is not showing people they were wrong, Maija. It's showing them how to be right. Maria looked at her father, the janitor who had secretly built an empire while being mocked by those who thought themselves above him. I think that's a lesson the Hendersons are finally learning, she said.